A top Russian official says Moscow will not be pressured into making concessions to the U.S. during diplomatic talks about Ukraine. Senior U.S. and Russian diplomats are scheduled to hold talks on Monday and Tuesday in Geneva. But Russia's deputy foreign minister said it is possible that the talks could end after a single meeting. President Biden has warned President Putin that Russia will face what he calls severe consequences if the Kremlin decides to invade Ukraine. U.S. officials are now describing a series of financial, technological, and military sanctions that could go into effect hours after a possible Russian invasion. Joining me now is CBS News correspondent Christina Ruffini. Christina, welcome. President Biden and Putin will not be directly involved in this week's diplomatic negotiations. So tell us, who's leading these talks and what do you expect?
So from the U.S. Side, it'll be Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, and she'll be meeting with her Russian counterparts on the first day of this meeting. It's a bilateral meeting between Russia and the U.S., and that was something that the presidents agreed to, President Putin and President Biden, when they met last year also in Europe. They said they were going to set up this strategic dialogue. Well, it's taken this long to actually get that first strategic dialogue going. After that, there's going to be a series of meetings with other European nations, with NATO, with the OSCE, which is an organization for European security, because it's really the U.S. approach to this problem, and the problem is what they see as Russian interference in Eastern Europe and especially on Ukraine. The U.S. is trying to approach it diplomatically from a we're stronger together standpoint. So they're really trying to first engage unilaterally with the Russians and then gather all the NATO and European allies who are also not thrilled about what's going on and would be really nervous if Russia started making gains in their backyard. So there'll be 3 days of meetings. And as you mentioned in your intro, at any point, any of the sides could walk away from the table, especially Moscow. I asked Secretary Blinken on Friday if it's possible Russia is approaching these meetings as kind of an excuse, almost a pretext to say, look, we presented our demands to the Americans, they said no, and give them an excuse to go ahead and do what they want to do, which is invade. And Secretary Blinken said that's very possible. It's in the Russian playbook, and we've seen it before.
So given how difficult it was just to get these two parties at the table, and given Russia's deputy foreign minister saying that the Kremlin is not going to be pressured by the U.S. to make any concessions, and as you mentioned, the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying we're unlikely to see a breakthrough, Christina, both parties have this attitude going into these meetings. What really is the point of these discussions?
Well, look, the Secretary of State was on a lot of Sunday shows today, and he said, we're not likely to see a big breakthrough. What it does is give us a chance to communicate. So I think the best way to think of this is essentially like a diplomatic festivus, right? A diplomatic airing of the grievances that gives everyone a chance to speak their piece and say, Russia can say, hey, U.S. and NATO, we think you're doing this and we don't like it. And the U.S. and the Europeans can say, hey, Russia, stop doing this. And then we'll see where we get, right? There are a couple places where a senior White House official said this week they actually think there is room to negotiate with the Russians. One of those is on military operations, military exercises near each other's borders, right? The U.S. said they're willing to talk about that. They're willing to negotiate with the Russians. If they'll reciprocate, both sides can agree, look, we won't have our troops, take their guns out and, practice near your border. Fine. The U.S. also said Russia has been really against any strategic weapon systems or these mid-range mid-range ballistic missiles being placed in Ukraine, either by NATO or the U.S. The U.S. said this week, that's fine with us. We don't really want to do that. So there are places they think they can get along. The other place is there used to be this thing called the INF Treaty, where both the U.S. and Russia agreed not to put these medium-range missiles in Europe. That fell apart during the last administration. The U.S. said Russia had been violating it. Russia had its own problems with the treaty. The U.S. said this week that they would be willing to go into some sort of a deal like that if the Russians would go along with it.
The airing of grievances, that makes sense, and we hope that it ends there. But if it does make it to feats of strength, well, we've heard from the Biden administration that they were issuing new warnings to Russia. Tell us about the sanctions that the White House is considering if Russia does decide to move forward and invade Ukraine. And are sanctions really enough to have an impact and deterrence in this way, Christina?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the U.S., the Biden administration has used pretty much every adjective and synonym for the word large they can to try to preview these sanctions, right? Massive, huge, monumental, consequential, all of the above. They're looking at trying to ban certain technologies, trying to go after Russian weapons sales, trying to hit them on like international banking so they can't access different banks and they can't access the international monetary system. The problem is, like, the New York Times had a quote this week from a senior White House official where they asked them, in the past, have any U.S. sanctions ever deterred Russia from doing what it wants to do? Do you have any evidence previous U.S. sanctions have worked? And the answer was no. So we'll have to see.
Okay, so if that doesn't work as a deterrent, tell us what's the latest on Russia's military buildup near Ukraine's border. How many troops are there right now?
Well, a couple weeks ago, Russia did actually call back to their home bases about 10,000 forces in the area, in the border area around Ukraine and other places throughout Eastern Europe. The problem is they still have about 100,000 forces staged near the Ukrainian border. Now, remember, they still hold for the Crimean Peninsula, which they got in 2015. But there's the eastern region called the Donbass is something that they could feasibly invade and take hold of and keep hold of in the next couple months. And we had that U.S. intelligence report that said Russia could be poised to do that by the beginning of the year. Well, it's the beginning of the year. So it's a question of whether these talks are trying to hold back the inevitable or whether they're going to be used as an excuse, as an impetus for Russia to go ahead and do this thing that it wants to do. Now, it's unclear what Russian troops in other countries are doing. You know, they were involved off and on in Belarus with the President Lukashenko there having problems keeping hold of power. There were popular protests. We're now seeing Russian paratroopers in Kazakhstan. They were invited by the current president, Russia says, the government there says, to help put down these protests. But Secretary Blinken was asked today if he agreed with a statement that Vladimir Putin has these greater aspirations of trying to rebuild the Soviet Union. And he essentially said, yes, he thinks that is something Putin would like to do. So it's not just a matter of Russia in Ukraine. It's Russia in all of these different places and surging back to possibly become a threat to Europe that's going to be the real subject of these talks with all these countries, including the U.S., including NATO members, including other operators in Europe, trying to get together and deter Russia from doing what they really don't want it to do.
All right, Christina, thank you.
Thank you.